In today's video, we'll be looking at one of the more interesting British heavy cruisers. A ship that was present at the sinking of the battleship Bismarck, and a ship that was, in turn, sent under by Japanese air attack around a year later. The ship in question was HMS Dorsetshire. Outside Bismarck and her own sinking, the cruiser had an admittedly quiet life. However, those two big moments are just that, very big moments. So we'll be covering those today as well as the rest of the ship's service, something that, at least at first, generally mirrored her county-class sisters. These were the British take on a heavy treaty cruiser and some of the earliest of the type. The county-class design originated in the 1920s with the cruisers commissioned between 1928 and 1930, while the related York class would complete in the early 1930s. You can probably see why Dorsetshire's early service is largely similar to that of her sisters. The late 1920s and the 1930s, up to 1939, were largely uneventful for British warships, outside of neutrality patrols off Spain or witnessing the Sino-Japanese War. With that in mind, I'll briefly touch on the design before we get into that service. In regard to her design, Dorsetshire was the last of the county-class cruisers. Alongside her sister Norfolk, they made up the final subclass, preceded by the Kent and London subclasses. Each of these designs had some differences to them, which is why they're considered different groups. The Norfolks, in specific, were heavily based on the Londons, to the point that different sources will differ on what to call these ships. You'll see them sometimes lumped in with the other Londons. Sometimes they'll be described as the Dorsetshire class, as Friedman does. Other times they'll be called the Norfolk class. It does depend on which book you're looking at. Regardless, these changes in design were fairly minimal. The superstructure was slightly different, and the ships used a new twin 8-inch gun mount, the same one later fitted to the York class. As for tonnage, Dorsetshire was just over 10,000 tons, somewhere around 10,100 at her standard, with that going up to 13,400 when fully loaded, again depending on the source. That displacement allowed for what was, in the end, the standard county-class layout. 4 twin turrets in 2 superfiring pairs, one on the bow and one on the stern. Each of these carried 2 8-inch, 203mm guns for a total of 8 barrels. To support these, the cruiser carried a secondary battery of 4 4-inch, 102mm dual-purpose guns, in this case in 4 single mountings, along with 4 single-mounted 2-pounder pom-pom guns. Nothing out of the ordinary for the late 1920s. The same goes for the torpedo loadout, consisting of 2 quadruple launchers, one on either broadside. Where things did differ from other cruisers was the county-class armor scheme. The British ditched the traditional armor belt in favor of 1-inch splinter protection. The heaviest armor would, instead, be concentrated in armored boxes around the magazines. Those reached 4 inches in thickness. Even the deck armor was pretty thin, at only 1.25 inches over the machinery space. This was the concession the British made to the Washington Treaty tonnage limitation. Unwilling to give up endurance or firepower, they sacrificed armor protection. As for the speed, this wasn't particularly fast or slow. At a touch over 32 knots, it was pretty standard for a heavy cruiser of that time period. And that rounds things off for the design. It's time to move on to service history, such as it is. As I noted earlier, there's not a lot to say for the early years. It will pick up, but only very late in Dorsetshire's life. A life that began in the Portsmouth dockyard on September 21st, 1927, with the ship launched on January 29th, 1929, and commissioned on September 30th, 1930. This does mean she actually missed the 1920s, although that doesn't change a whole lot here. As she entered into service, Dorsetshire became the flagship of the 2nd Cruiser Squadron. This saw her serve as part of the Atlantic Fleet, although that was both short-lived and generally uneventful. The ship properly entered the fleet in 1931, where only one event of real note occurred: the Invergordon Mutiny on September 15th and 16th of 1931. This originated in a dispute over pay in the Great Depression and involved several ships and around 1,000 sailors. Dorsetshire's crew did have some men act up, but the ship wasn't really involved in the mutiny. Regardless, as 1931 came to an end after this, not much happened. Dorsetshire remained in the Atlantic Fleet until shifting to the Africa Station in 1933. She would remain based out of Simonstown until 1935. As I mentioned in my recent Perth video, not much really took place on that station, showing the flag and training duty for the most part. Pretty much the same as most postings in the 1930s, really. In any event, Dorsetshire left Africa in 1935 for a short refit before shifting to the China Station in 1936. That had the potential to be more exciting as the Japanese began their latest war in China in 1937. However, as near as I can tell, Dorsetshire didn't get up to much while there. That said, during her late 1930s service, the ship received the most notable of her refits: the replacement of her single 4-inch guns with 4 twin mounts, bringing the total barrel count to 8 4-inch dual-purpose guns. Later on, when war broke out, that anti-aircraft battery was further reinforced by 20mm cannon. That aside, the rest of the 1930s passed without major incident. The ship would join Hermes and Cumberland in testing Singapore's defenses in early 1937. But beyond that, she didn't get up too much, with Dorsetshire still serving on the China Station as late as 1939. In fact, the cruiser was still in China when war broke out in September 1939. She remained in Chinese waters until around mid-October, when the ship was transferred to Singapore. She arrived there on October 18th before sailing on to Colombo and Ceylon, arriving there on October 25th. At this point, she would sail to hunt German raiders in the Indian Ocean, particularly Groff's Bay. However, nothing was found, with Dorsetshire eventually transferred to the South Atlantic on December 3rd, 1939. The cruiser would make her voyage, arriving back in her old haunt at Simonstown on December 10th. She still wouldn't catch any German raiders during this period, while the Battle of the River Plate took place on December 13th. In the aftermath of that action, Dorsetshire was sent off to join with the British cruisers off South America, arriving at Port Stanley on December 24th. At this point, Dorsetshire joined HMS Cumberland in patrolling off Montevideo. She would remain in the South Atlantic on this and other duties until late January 1940. Specifically, January 21st, when Dorsetshire helped escort the damaged HMS Exeter back to Britain for repairs. While Exeter continued on home, Dorsetshire turned back south. She would continue to hunt German raiders until March 1940, with only one success in the form of the freighter Wakama off the coast of Brazil. Dorsetshire's scouts spotted that ship on February 11th or 12th, depending on the source. The German crew promptly set about scuttling their vessel, with Dorsetshire arriving in time to pick up 45 or 46 survivors. Nothing of major note happened after this until March. Dorsetshire took her prisoners and wounded sailors from Exeter to Cape Town on March 11th, before then sailing to Simonstown for an overhaul on the 15th. She would remain there until May 1940, at which point the cruiser finally returned to Britain for another overhaul that lasted until June 9th. When this was done, the cruiser was sent off to support operations off Dakar. In this, she joined HMS Hermes in watching the Vichy French, including an abortive attempt to move the battleship Richelieu to Morocco on June 25, 1940. Dorsetshire remained in this general area until late July, including dodging an attack by French submarines on July 3rd. Beyond that, not much happened until November 1940. Dorsetshire patrolled and escorted convoys from July through November, based out of Freetown or Simonstown, with one detour to the Red Sea in late October. She arrived in Yemen in late November 1940, although this was only to escort a convoy, because Dorsetshire turned right back around to return to the Atlantic, only making a short stopover off Italian Somalia for shore bombardment on November 18th. After that, things were mostly quiet for the rest of 1940, aside from an attempt to hunt Admiral Scheer down on December 18th. The same would mostly be true for 1941. From January through May, there wasn't much of note other than more convoy escorts and patrol duty, with the exception of capturing a Vichy French transport, Mendoza, in January, and picking up survivors from a torpedoed merchant, Oakdean, in early May. 35 men rescued on May 6th. That was the last notable event before the engagement with Bismarck in late May. Dorsetshire departed Freetown to escort a convoy to Britain on May 11th. That voyage, taking the ship north, allowed Dorsetshire to sail into the Atlantic at the same time Bismarck was doing her thing. As a result, Dorsetshire was detached from the convoy on May 26, 1941, when the cruiser was about 670 kilometers, 360 nautical miles, or 410 miles south of the battleship. Dorsetshire steamed north as fast as she could from full speed to 20 knots as the weather worsened. Around 8:30 in the morning on May 27th, she met up with HMS Cossack and got close enough to see Bismarck's gun flashes by 8:50. Not long after this, she drew close enough to engage Bismarck with her own guns. However, poor visibility hampered things here, with Dorsetshire firing 254 shells to questionable results. More critically, the cruiser was ordered to close in towards the end of the battle to torpedo Bismarck. 2 torpedoes are commonly cited as hitting. Those torpedoes are often the center of the "was the ship scuttled or sunk by torpedo" controversy, which I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole, at least for now. Regardless, Dorsetshire would stand by and pick up survivors. Ultimately, 85 or 86 men, with one later dying in the latter case, were picked up by the cruiser. It's one of the most famous images of the battle. There's some level of controversy here as well in relation to a supposed submarine sighting calling off the rescue. Again, a bit too meaty a topic to dig into here. Maybe a dedicated video in the future. For now, Dorsetshire carried the survivors to Britain, After dropping those men off, the cruiser went in for a refit. This lasted from June until the end of July 1941, with working up lasting into August. Dorsetshire only returned to convoy escort at the end of August, where she sailed back to Freetown and South Atlantic duty. This was mostly convoy escort duty, but the cruiser did attempt to track down Admiral Hipper in late August. This failed. After that failed hunt, the cruiser spent the rest of 1941 on escort duty, with the exception of an attempt to hunt the raider Atlantis in November. That once again failed to find the ship. On the other hand, Dorsetshire did find and engage the supply ship Python on December 1st. Since the ship was found while supplying 2 U-boats, Dorsetshire didn't stick around to pick up survivors after the German ship sank. Considering one of those submarines fired a spread of 5 torpedoes, it's an understandable precaution. That said, once this was done, the cruiser returned to escort work. This would remain her role for much of her remaining service life, with Dorsetshire shifting to the Indian Ocean in January 1942. She would then be assigned to escort convoys to Singapore in February. Of course, with Singapore's fall, that was short-lived. So in March, Dorsetshire was reassigned once again, this time to the Eastern Fleet, which would be her final duty. Because at the start of April 1942, the Japanese performed their famous Indian Ocean raid. Dorsetshire, alongside HMS Cornwall, would be spotted by Japanese aircraft on April 5, 1942, and then subjected to heavy air attack. Within 8 minutes, the cruiser was hit by 10 bombs and several near misses. One of those bombs blew up a magazine, which contributed to the ship sinking within 20 minutes. Considering the British cruisers were attacked by over 50 dive bombers, this is not surprising. Fortunately, most of the crew would survive. There were 1,546 men between the 2 cruisers. 1,122 were picked up by HMS Enterprise and 2 destroyers the next day. Dorsetshire's story came to an end, but at least most of her crew would live to fight another day. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.